I'm Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. We all bring assumptions to our decision-making, and experts emphasize that we should regularly reevaluate those assumptions to protect against traps like confirmation bias. Our assumption audits help you do just that by taking advantage of the thousands of hours of knowledge curation we've organized in the Climate Web. You can learn more at the conclusion of this assumption audit. So let's jump in. We'll start with a review of the key issues involved in this assumption audit. Carbon offsets have been based on the idea of avoiding the emissions of or removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Additionality has required that the tons being credited as avoided emissions would have otherwise been emitted. But what about carbon being kept out of the atmosphere through effective local or national stewardship of soils and forests? Shouldn't that stewardship be incentivized? And it probably should be. Efforts are underway to change the definition of offsets and the additionality criterion in particular to allow stewarded carbon to be incorporated into offset markets. The question for this assumption audit is, what are the implications of that for the environmental integrity of offset markets? Before digging into these topics, it should be clear that there is a large literature on carbon offsets generally. There's a large literature on the topic of the additionality of offsets. And there's a large literature on the whole topic of critiquing and evaluating the performance of carbon offsets. A lot of questions exist regarding how offset markets are being implemented, and in particular, the environmental integrity of existing offset markets. But that's beyond the scope of this assumptions audit. For purposes of the questions we want to explore, I'm going to focus on the work of Reseed.farm, in part because they have an excellent white paper that lays out the topics that need to be talked about very clearly. But they're certainly not the only group relevant to this whole conversation. You can see here that we've gone through Reseed's white paper and extracted relevant paragraphs and other materials that are worth exploring. And you can rapidly scan the points we've extracted if you wish. The link is in the YouTube video description. You'll notice that Reseed's white paper is also organized under the topical heading of Ecosystem Services Payments in the Climate Web. That's because what Reseed is proposing overlaps in a big way with the idea of ecosystem services payments. People have been talking for years about giving ecosystem services a financial value to compensate the stewards of those services for the value that they're helping deliver. And that's a totally legitimate idea. The problem is that no one has been able to figure out who's going to pay for all of those ecosystem services. A really big question if global GDP is 18 trillion and ecosystem services, as suggested in this presentation, are worth $33 trillion. What we're talking about in this assumption audit is whether offset market funding should in effect be going to pay for ecosystem services. Let's start with Reseed's framework. Reseed is arguing, correctly, that smallholder farmers around the world are stewards of a lot of carbon, and that smallholder farmers are under a lot of pressure that could ultimately cause the release of some of that stewarded carbon. Existing carbon markets are arguably not fair to smallholder farmers because existing carbon markets won't reward the good stewardship in terms of keeping the soils and the forests that they already have. Reseed argues that the current rules for offset markets, specifically with regard to additionality, permanence, and leakage, prevent offset markets from scaling to the level that's needed to mitigate climate change. Reseed proposes to sell tokenized carbon credits to help pay smallholder farmers to deliver ecosystem services. And Reseed says that it wants to bring almost 4 gigatons or 4 billion tons of CO2 credits to market by 2028. Now, it's worth noting specifically that Reseed's language in their white paper states that its carbon assets are not carbon offsets, but instead do represent the delivery of ecosystem services. In fact, Reseed argues that its carbon asset credits are superior to carbon offset credits because they're not based on counterfactual baselines, but on real, verifiable, existing assets. And Reseed argues that the best way to reduce your carbon footprint or to make money investing in the carbon market is with its carbon assets, not conventional carbon offsets. And that's how you accomplish mitigation at scale. But there's a fundamental problem in Reseed's logic. You can't just say a carbon asset isn't a carbon offset and then propose selling it into the voluntary carbon offset market as an offset. Reseed is explicitly saying that you can use their carbon asset credits to reduce your carbon footprint, but they're obviously not reducing your carbon footprint per se. They're claiming to offset it, and with credits that don't meet today's carbon offset rules. And here's why that's a big problem. About 20 years ago, my team spent a few hours calculating U.S. emissions reductions and sequestration, having nothing to do with carbon markets, but that could, under some worldview, qualify as carbon offsets if you start considering fairness. You'll see here we quantified the CO2 associated with existing renewable generation and nuclear and public transit and bike riding and sequestration on private timberlands. This number would probably be a lot larger today. And in terms of fairness, if someone comes up with a carbon offset program to promote electric vehicles next year, for example, why shouldn't people who bought a Prius last year qualify for that program? The graphic shows, though, that there are billions of tons of avoided emissions and removals that fall into the category of business as usual. They would have happened with or without the existence of carbon markets. And if those billions of tons were allowed to be credited as carbon offsets, it could easily negate the environmental integrity of a carbon market. Unfortunately, incorporating fairness into offset markets could rapidly wipe out their environmental integrity. When it comes to Reseed's approach, Reseed talks about bringing 4 billion tons of CO2 credits to market by 2028. But how many tons of CO2 equivalent are actually stored in soils and forests around the world today? According to this carbon cycle diagram, it's about 7,500 gigatons, 7,500 billion tons. You heard that correctly. That is a lot of CO2. The problem is that you could pay landowners, including smallholder farmers, for thousands of billions of tons of stewarded carbon that would not otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere, including, by the way, fossil fuel carbon, and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere would keep rising, due simply to the 50 billion tons coming from human activities. And climate change would keep advancing. So to wrap up this assumption audit, it's definitely true that it's very important that the huge amounts of carbon currently stored in soils and forests be kept out of the atmosphere. No question about that. And there should be mechanisms in place to encourage stewardship of carbon in soils and forests. There's no question about that. The problem is that carbon offsets justify emissions today, in particular as part of net zero commitments, which is where a lot of the demand for carbon offsets is going to be in coming years. And net zero commitments can only be accomplished by crediting tons that would have otherwise been emitted. You can't claim net zero if you're protecting tons that never would have been emitted to the atmosphere. And the fact that there are 7,500 billion tons of CO2 equivalent in the soils and vegetation clearly establishes the potential for totally swamping carbon offset markets, which are likely to be less than 10 gigatons, 10 out of 7,500, for quite a while. And the potential for that swamping, the potential for gaming of the system is massive, and there's simply no two ways around it. The choice to allow stewardship tons into offset markets, while it might advance the idea of fairness, has to undermine the environmental integrity of offset markets.